On the morning of 27th of April 1944, two American fighter pilots crossed the French coastline at low altitude, engines throttled back just enough to reduce their visibility against the cloud cover. They were flying separate aircraft, but operating under the same mission parameters, part of a broader Allied effort to disrupt German transportation and communications ahead of the planned invasion of Western Europe. Northern France at this stage of the war was not simply occupied. It was saturated with German forces, layered with radar coverage, anti-aircraft batteries, and a dense network of Luftwaffe fighter patrols tasked with preventing exactly this kind of penetration. For Allied pilots, crossing the Channel and flying over occupied territory meant accepting that any mechanical failure, navigational error, or moment of hesitation could turn a routine sortie into a fight for survival on hostile ground. The two pilots, both assigned to a U.S. Army Air Forces fighter group operating out of southern England, had already completed several missions over France in the preceding weeks. Their aircraft were rugged, fast, and designed to absorb punishment, but no fighter was immune to the realities of combat fatigue and enemy fire. That morning's mission had begun without incident. The flight plan was straightforward: cross the Channel, descend to low altitude, strike a rail junction used by German supply trains, and return before Luftwaffe response time could concentrate interceptors in the area. Such missions were considered routine by the spring of 1944, yet casualty rates remained high. The Germans had adapted quickly to Allied tactics, and the skies over France were increasingly contested despite Allied numerical superiority. As the pilots approached their target area, German anti-aircraft fire erupted from multiple positions along the rail line. The flak was accurate and heavy, forcing the Americans to break formation and maneuver independently. One pilot took a hit to his engine cowling, the other sustained damage to his cooling system. Neither aircraft was immediately crippled, but both pilots recognized that continuing the mission or attempting the return flight would risk total engine failure over enemy territory. The decision they faced was stark and immediate. Attempting to reach the Channel with a compromised engine often ended with a forced ditching at sea or a crash into occupied countryside. Landing deliberately offered at least a chance of survival, though it meant capture, interrogation, and imprisonment, if not worse. The two pilots exchanged brief hand signals and radio acknowledgements. They were not landing together out of preference, but out of necessity. Their damaged aircraft could not maintain altitude for long, and they needed open terrain clear of obstacles. After several tense minutes scanning the countryside below, they identified a small agricultural field on the outskirts of a rural French village. It was not an airfield. It was not even flat by aviation standards. But it was long enough, free of trees, and dry enough to support a controlled landing if executed correctly. Each pilot understood the risk. Landing a high-performance fighter on an improvised field was dangerous even under ideal conditions. Doing so under enemy occupation, with the possibility of German patrols nearby, added a layer of urgency that no training exercise could fully replicate. The first aircraft touched down hard but intact. The pilot brought it to a halt just short of a hedgerow, cutting the engine immediately to reduce fire risk. The second aircraft followed seconds later, its landing rougher, the undercarriage absorbing a punishing impact that sent a plume of dust and debris into the air. When the dust settled, both aircraft were grounded but largely intact. The pilots exited their cockpits quickly, sidearms drawn, scanning the surrounding fields and farm buildings for movement. The countryside was deceptively quiet. No gunfire, no shouting. No immediate response from German forces. That silence was not reassuring, it was ominous. The pilots moved toward each other, exchanging quick assessments of their aircraft and injuries. Both were shaken but unhurt. Their planes, however, told a different story. One aircraft's engine damage appeared severe but localized. The cooling system had been compromised, yet the airframe remained structurally sound. The other aircraft had suffered internal damage that was not immediately visible but had rendered its engine unreliable. Oil leaks were evident, and attempts to restart the engine produced irregular combustion and alarming vibrations. In practical terms, only one aircraft had a realistic chance of flying again. At this point, the pilots faced a decision that was not covered in any manual. They were deep in occupied France, miles from the coast, with German units likely to respond once the landing was reported. The options available were limited and unforgiving. They could destroy both aircraft and attempt to evade capture together, relying on the French countryside and the uncertain assistance of local civilians. They could separate, each attempting to escape independently on foot. Or one pilot could attempt to repair and fly one aircraft out, leaving the other behind. Each option carried risks, not only for themselves but for anyone who might aid them. The reality of the situation asserted itself quickly. The damaged aircraft could not be made airworthy in the time available. Cannibalizing parts would take hours they did not have. German response times in occupied France varied, but reports from downed aircrew indicated that patrols often arrived within 30 to 60 minutes of a reported landing. The sound of the aircraft engines alone would have alerted nearby units. The longer they remained, the narrower their chances became. The pilots understood that if both stayed, both would almost certainly be captured. If one left, at least one might return to Allied lines. The decision was not framed as heroism or sacrifice. It was framed as probability. One aircraft could potentially fly. One could not. One pilot could escape. One likely would not. The pilot whose aircraft was damaged beyond repair recognized this immediately. He did not argue the point. He understood the arithmetic of survival as clearly as his companion did. They had flown together long enough to know that hesitation would only worsen the outcome. As they worked quickly around the remaining serviceable aircraft, the sound of distant movement began to filter through the stillness. Dogs barking. A vehicle engine somewhere beyond the tree line. The pilots did not know whether these sounds belonged to German forces or civilians, but they could not afford to wait for confirmation. They armed demolition charges on the disabled aircraft, placing them near critical components to ensure it could not be captured intact. The destruction of an aircraft was not merely symbolic. It denied the enemy intelligence on Allied technology and prevented the plane from being displayed or exploited for propaganda. Before separating, the pilots exchanged documents and small personal items. Such exchanges were common among airmen who understood the realities of capture. Letters, identification papers, and photographs could become liabilities during interrogation. They agreed on basic evasion principles: avoid roads, move at night, trust no one without verification. They did not speak of reunion. They did not speak of the future. The focus remained fixed on the immediate task. The pilot assigned to the flyable aircraft climbed back into his cockpit, hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the pressure of the moment. He ran through abbreviated checks, knowing that any delay increased the risk of detection. The engine started unevenly, coughing before settling into a rough but workable rhythm. The pilot advanced the throttle cautiously, testing the response. The aircraft vibrated but held. It would fly, but only just. As the engine noise grew louder, the other pilot moved away from the field, disappearing into the hedgerows. He did not watch the takeoff. Watching would have served no purpose and would have increased the risk of being seen. He focused instead on memorizing landmarks, orienting himself to the terrain, and preparing for the long process of evasion that lay ahead. The remaining aircraft accelerated across the uneven field, bouncing and swaying as it gathered speed. For a moment, it seemed as though the terrain would claim it, the wheels threatening to dig in and overturn the aircraft. Then, abruptly, it lifted free of the ground, clearing the hedgerow by meters. The pilot climbed shallowly, avoiding sudden maneuvers that might stress the damaged systems. Within seconds, the aircraft was a dark shape against the low cloud cover, heading west toward the channel and relative safety. Behind him, on the ground in occupied France, the other pilot was alone. The German response came quickly. Within minutes of the takeoff, Vehicles arrived at the field, soldiers dismounting and fanning out with practiced efficiency. They found the destroyed aircraft still smoldering, its twisted metal offering clear evidence of Allied presence. Tracks led away from the field into the surrounding countryside. The Germans followed them, aware that one pilot had escaped by air, but determined to capture the other. For the pilot on foot, the war entered a new phase, one defined not by aerial combat but by concealment, patience, and the constant threat of betrayal. What followed would test the limits of Allied evasion networks, civilian resistance and individual endurance in ways that no flight training could prepare a pilot for. Only one American aircraft had left the field that day. Only one pilot had taken off, but the story of the one who remained would unfold slowly, across weeks of danger and decisions made in silence, far from the roar of engines and the relative clarity of combat in the air. Once the sound of the departing aircraft faded into the low cloud cover, the pilot who remained on the ground in occupied France confronted the reality of his situation with clarity rather than panic. He was alone, unarmed beyond a sidearm that would be of limited use against patrols, and dressed in a flight suit that marked him unmistakably as an enemy airman. The destruction of the aircraft had denied the Germans a functioning fighter, but it had also ensured that any search would be methodical and determined. The pilot understood that capture was not a question of if, but of when, unless he could disappear into the countryside and find assistance from civilians willing to risk their lives to help him. The field in which the aircraft had landed offered no concealment. Its openness had made it suitable for an emergency landing, but now it left him exposed. He moved quickly toward the hedgerows, keeping low and avoiding any straight-line movement that might leave clear tracks. The countryside of northern France in the spring of 1944 was deceptive in its beauty. Rolling fields, narrow lanes, and small villages created an appearance of tranquility that masked the constant presence of occupation forces. German units were quartered in farmhouses, barns, and commandeered civilian buildings. Roadblocks were common, and local collaborators supplemented regular patrols. For downed Allied airmen, survival depended on understanding this landscape not as neutral ground, but as a controlled environment where every movement carried risk. The pilot's training had prepared him for evasion in theory, but the practical application demanded patience and restraint. He avoided roads entirely, moving instead along field boundaries and irrigation ditches, guided by the position of the sun and a rough sense of direction toward the west. Within hours, German search parties were active in the area. The pilot could hear them before he saw them: the crunch of boots, the low commands, the occasional bark of a dog. He concealed himself in a drainage culvert as one patrol passed within meters, their rifles slung casually but their attention alert. Such moments defined evasion. Movement was possible only in brief windows of opportunity, when noise or terrain masked his presence. Time stretched unnaturally, minutes feeling like hours as he remained motionless, controlling his breathing and suppressing the urge to flee blindly. Every decision was calculated. Every movement was deliberate. As night fell, the pilot resumed his slow progress. He knew that darkness offered concealment, but it also carried its own dangers. German patrols increased after dusk, particularly in areas where Allied landings or parachute drops were suspected. The pilot moved cautiously, stopping frequently to listen. He avoided houses and villages, recognizing that knocking on the wrong door could lead to immediate betrayal. The success of the resistance varied by region and individual. Some civilians were deeply committed to aiding Allied airmen. Others, motivated by fear or ideology, cooperated with the occupiers. Distinguishing between them without prior contact was nearly impossible. By the second night, exhaustion began to take its toll. The pilot had eaten nothing since before the mission, and dehydration slowed his movements. Despite this, he continued, driven by the knowledge that stopping completely would only allow German patrols to close in. On the morning of the third day, he reached a small wooded area near a secondary road. From his concealed position, he He observed a farmhouse at the edge of the trees. Smoke rose from its chimney. Chickens moved freely in the yard. It was a working farm, not a military outpost. The pilot weighed his options carefully. Approaching the farmhouse carried significant risk, but continued evasion without food or assistance would soon become impossible. He waited until late afternoon, watching for signs of German presence. When none appeared, he approached cautiously, hands visible, ready to retreat at the first indication of danger. The farmer who answered the door was middle-aged, his expression guarded. The pilot spoke only a few words of French, enough to identify himself as an American airman. He did not plead. He stated his situation plainly and waited. The pause that followed was long and silent. In occupied France, silence was often a test. Finally, the farmer nodded and gestured for the pilot to enter. This act of assistance was not impulsive. French civilians who aided Allied airmen did so with full awareness of the consequences. Discovery could result in imprisonment, deportation, or execution. The farmer provided food, civilian clothing, and temporary shelter, instructing the pilot to remain hidden during daylight hours. Over the next several days, the pilot remained in the farmhouse's attic, emerging only at night. The farmer's wife and children were aware of his presence but spoke little. Their cooperation was quiet and efficient, devoid of sentimentality. This was not the first time they had helped an Allied airman, and it would not be the last. Through the farmer, contact was made with a local resistance network. These networks operated in cells, with limited knowledge shared between members to reduce the risk of compromise. The pilot was introduced to a courier who provided false identification papers and arranged safe movement between farms. Each transfer carried risk, and each person involved accepted it without discussion. The pilot's role was to comply, remain inconspicuous, and trust the system that had been built under years of occupation. Meanwhile, German efforts to locate the missing pilot intensified. Reports of the forced landing and the destroyed aircraft had circulated through local command channels. Patrols increased in frequency. Checkpoints appeared on roads previously unguarded. The Germans understood that a downed pilot represented not only a potential intelligence asset if captured, but also a symbolic failure if he escaped. The occupation relied on the perception of control. Allowing an American airman to evade capture undermined that perception. For the pilot who had taken off, the situation was different but no less tense. His flight back toward the channel was conducted at low altitude, avoiding known flak concentrations. The damaged aircraft vibrated continuously, and engine temperatures remained unstable. He resisted the urge to push the throttle, knowing that overtaxing the engine could result in failure over water. When he finally crossed the coastline and reached Allied-controlled airspace, the relief was tempered by the knowledge that his companion was still behind enemy lines. He reported the forced landing and separation upon return, providing precise coordinates and details that could aid any rescue or intelligence assessment. Beyond that, there was little he could do. Once an airman was on the ground in occupied territory, his fate rested largely in the hands of others. Back in France, the pilot on the ground moved slowly through the resistance network. Each safe house provided temporary refuge but no permanence. The goal was not to hide indefinitely, but to move him south toward routes that could eventually lead to Spain or to the coast for extraction. This process took weeks. During that time, the pilot learned to adopt the rhythms of civilian life. He worked briefly on farms, performed manual labor, and avoided any behavior that might draw attention. His American accent, once a marker of identity, became a liability. Silence became his primary defense. The risk of betrayal was constant. The resistance was effective but not infallible. German counterintelligence operations sought to infiltrate and dismantle these networks. Arrests were frequent, and the loss of a single courier could compromise multiple safe houses. The pilot experienced close calls, including one instance where a planned transfer was aborted when German soldiers appeared unexpectedly. In another case, a farmhouse he had vacated hours earlier was searched, its occupants questioned aggressively. The pilot was never informed of the outcome. Such knowledge would have been both distracting and dangerous. As the weeks passed, Allied operations intensified across France. Air activity increased, and the sounds of distant bombing became more frequent. The pilot followed these developments indirectly, piecing together fragments of information from his hosts. He understood that the invasion was approaching, though the exact timing remained uncertain. For him, survival depended on remaining unnoticed until the larger strategic picture changed in his favor. Eventually, arrangements were made to move him toward the coast, where clandestine extraction by boat was possible under favorable conditions. This final phase of evasion was the most dangerous. Coastal areas were heavily patrolled, and German forces were particularly alert to Allied infiltration attempts. The pilot traveled at night, accompanied by guides who knew the terrain intimately. Each step brought him closer to freedom, but also increased the risk of discovery. The extraction, when it came, was executed without ceremony. A small vessel waited offshore, its crew operating under strict radio silence. The pilot boarded quickly, leaving behind the land that had both threatened and protected him. As the boat moved away from the coast, he did not look back. The experience had stripped away any sense of triumph. Survival was not victory, it was merely continuation. When the war ended, the stories of downed airmen who evaded capture were often simplified into narratives of daring escapes and heroic resistance. The reality was more subdued. It was a process defined by waiting, concealment, and reliance on strangers whose courage rarely received recognition. The pilot who had remained in France owed his survival not to bold action, but to the quiet resolve of civilians who operated under constant threat. The two pilots were eventually reunited after the war. Their reunion was brief and unremarkable. They spoke of the forced landing only in factual terms, avoiding speculation or emotional reflection. The decision that had separated them remained understood rather than discussed. One aircraft had been able to fly, one had not. One pilot had taken off, one had stayed behind. That moment in a French field, measured in minutes, had set two divergent paths in motion. Both pilots survived the war, but their experiences diverged sharply. One returned immediately to the familiar dangers of aerial combat. The other entered a different war altogether. One fought in silence, shadows, and trust. Their story illustrates a fundamental truth of the air war over Europe. Survival did not end when an aircraft left the sky. For some, it only began when the engines stopped.